So what konuardadu se wagwegu gaditsaguts de yujuts. My English name is Lindsay Delaronde. I am the Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator for the Fine Arts Department. This is our fifth series, our fifth interview for the Blue Heron series. I'm very grateful this morning as I was pondering and thinking about people that I respect and admire and I follow. Monique Mojica was obviously a person that I've recently met in person, and we had the opportunity to do some workshops together at UVic, and she even had time to come and visit with some of the work that I was doing with community. So thank you so much for your time this morning. I know you're in Toronto and we're kind of in two different places, but it's always a real honor to sit and get to learn and hear what your experience has been in your art practice. And so I'm just gonna leave it to you to introduce yourself.
Noe di Lindsay, noe gambi, anuga olo nadili, olo edibili, ganosokta. I'm Monique Mojica. I am Guna and Rappahannock by birth. So it's both Central American Indigenous and North American Indigenous from the Powhatan Confederacy. And I am adopted into the Cayuga Bear clan of the Haudenosaunee at Six Nations. My son's family is. So in order for him to have a clan, they adopted me.
Nice. Yeah.
The bears claimed us.
Nice.
I was born in New York City in the mid-50s, so I've been on the planet for a while. And I was born into a performing family, a theatrical family. My grandpa, who was Kuna, from the autonomous territory of Kunayala in the community of Yanduk Nargana, was a able-bodied seaman, a merchant marine. And in 1923, he docked for the last time in Brooklyn. And one of his shipmates said, another Kuna guy, because a lot of them were sailors. They were, sidebar, they were on the sailing ships since the 1500s because they got on the pirate ships to fight the Spanish Armada. So one of his shipmates said to him, I have a date with an Indian girl. She has a sister. And the rest is history. During the Great Depression in the 30s, my grandpa had a choice in terms of putting food on the table to feed his family. And one was to go on the welfare line. It was to play Indian. So he and some of the other native people that found themselves living in New York made their living, and they came from all over. Wow. One of his best friends was Hopi, and there were Apaches and Winnebagos and lots of Mohawks and Senecas who performed in Lakotas for rodeos and Wild West shows and circuses, and my family was in the sideshow at a place called Golden City Amusement Park, which was a competitor to Coney Island.
Oh, wow.
So from there, my mom and her sisters went on to study Euro music, dance, and theater, and in the mid-70s formed Spiderwoman Theater. So I would say my artistic lineage comes from that family history,
right?
From singing and dancing for tourists and being in the freak show, generation away from the freak show.
Right.
And into the kind of theater that was meant to explode the traditional and conservative structure of Eurocentered theater, right? So I'm always shocked when people are talking about this devised theater as being experimental, because I'm old and that's what I was trained in the 50s and 60s.
Right,
So
right.
I find it shocking, and maybe it's more in Canada because, yeah, in the 60s it was, yeah, it was the avant-garde, but those things in New York anyway, the things that are pushing boundaries are celebrated in a way that they're not on the Canada side to this day. So my mom got me into every kiddie dance theater, music theory and art class that she could find a bursary for, a little brown girl.
Wow.
So I've really been doing this all my life. Like since I've been doing this for 63 years, since I was 3. And I think it's had quite a trajectory. I'm in a different place now than I was when I first was asked to come to Canada to be the second artistic director of Native Earth Performing Arts. I think we were in a place there where we just wanted to be able to explain us to them. And because I started in dance, I also think that my approach to creating work and creating ensemble work, which is my interest is ensemble work. My interest is creating organic text, which for me means putting the body first. My work privileges stories in the body, not the written text. For me, the progression is impulse, gesture, sound, movement. Text is last.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is at odds with the way that theater institutions do research, development, workshop, and production.
Interesting. That's an interesting sort of, in the way that sort of, like you're talking, more Eurocentric theater practices really honor the written word. It's a very colonial language. It really, I think, narrows and excludes all of the body, the breath, the gesture, the impulse, the intuitive.
Yes.
Mostly, yeah. So,
and the way I work, my premise is the body is text. And if you're telling the story through the body, you don't need as much text.
Right. And it's interesting as a viewer, like as an audience of someone receiving the work, how have you heard, or what is that? Has there been dialogue that you've had in your career to be able to engage with audience and really understand how it's being received? How is that relationship with the work that you've been able to do about the body? Like you said, less text. How has it been received?
Well, of course, it runs a gamut. And I don't read reviews.
Right.
I'm afraid not to read them.
Yeah.
You know, at least until the show's closed, and sometimes not ever do I read them. Sometimes I would say that with Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way, There were people who were really, really aware that, oh, this was not created for me. It wasn't created for me to understand. I don't understand it. I have to come back several times. And I have to come with the understanding that it's not for me, primarily. I'm not the primary audience for this. There were Indigenous people who understood it immediately from a visceral place.
Exactly, yeah.
There were people who felt like, I don't know what story I'm in. There are 3 stories being told at the same time. What am I supposed to do with this? And one night I remember my mom and I being really scared because there was a contingent of Guna educators who somehow made it, and they were in the audience, and it was like, oh God, here we are, gotta get the language right, gotta get the story. Here we are, we're generations removed from my grandmother's place, but they understood what we said, and they understood the stories, and they understood the story we were telling. In my work, usually by the end, there's some Native woman sobbing uncontrollably in the back. And that's my barometer. You know, I really detest answering all of those dramaturgical questions like, who's your audience? You know, it's anyone who will bother to understand something told from a non-linear, embodied Indigenous lens. And if you don't know where you are, where you're walking, whose land you're on, and the history of the place, of land and place, and if you can't connect to the stories of land and place, yeah, I'd say probably people would have a hard time understanding my work.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I really like how you talk about understanding viscerally, because we all have human bodies. And I think in particular with Indigenous theater practices or the aesthetics, some of the aesthetics of Indigenous theater, it creates a universal language, you know. We all understand drum sound. We all understand, you know, circle in different ways, and medicines that might come in, or
you know, I don't think that's universal. I usually take exception to the word universal, maybe not in what it means, it's meant to mean, but in practice what it means, and when it's used to in theater settings, like, oh, Shakespeare is universal, you know, it means as white as I am, therefore valid, you know, just like, and saying, I mean, I don't think Shakespeare is universal. I think Shakespeare is very specific to a time, a place, a land, and a history.
Right.
And I don't even think that the drum is universal anymore to people of European ancestry to whom it's been ripped away. They have to work really hard. They have to do their own work of reconnecting to that drum before they can say, hey, yeah, we had drums for centuries. They were a bird. So I think that there's a big leap there. That I think there's something that predicates the understanding, the visceral understanding, and I was talking about, and that is the willingness to imagine a different aesthetic. You use the word aesthetic, and I think that's a really important word, because each one of our nations has its own aesthetic. And working from that is something I have to give props to Floyd Favel, who I worked with for over 20 years. And what I took from that time is really, really important in the work that I went forward with, and that where he started was in identifying where he started because he was at the beginning part of Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Ways, and identifying the artistic aesthetic in a piece of material culture or the artistic aesthetic of an indigenous culture. The principles in that aesthetic. And if you identify and choose those, in Princess Pocahontas, in Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way, there were 4 Guna aesthetic principles that went through all the culture. I used the mola textiles and the pictographs and created the structure from that. So if an audience is willing to accept that there are many different aesthetic principles, then they can understand a performance that is rooted in an indigenous culture that they don't know. Like if you were to create something using the aesthetic of wampum belt, you know, it would first take you into a journey of learning what that aesthetic is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what are the actions? What is necessary to create that wampum belt, and then figuring out how do you transpose that to dramatic performance.
Really.
So that's the work that I've been doing.
It's interesting because when we're talking about, you know, using indigenous knowledge and aesthetics, I think what it cultivates also is that resurgence, that remembering, relearning some of our cultures, you know, and the severing impacts of colonization, the lack of that knowledge being passed down to our generations. When we go into this work creatively, we get to relearn and reclaim and remember, I think, some of those principles that are not always available to us in our family dynamics and in our history. So I think that's really powerful.
That's the first step.
Yeah.
And having to relearn them. I grew up with molas my entire life, but the first thing I had to do, I knew some stories that I wanted to tell, but I didn't have a framework, I didn't have a shape, I didn't have a container for them. But the first thing I had to do was to learn how to read a mola, because it's a story narrative.
Right.
A wampum belt has a story narrative.
Yeah.
A beaded Métis octopus bag has a story narrative.
Totally.
So it's learning what the rules are of that narrative. What are the literary principles within the ways that we tell story?
Yeah.
And what can you use, all the while being very mindful of the protocols of each one of those cultures and protecting those things that must remain collectively private.
Right.
So in terms of practices, you have to always ask permission.
Totally.
And you have to offer up whatever is asked in order to take and use, in order to activate, take, use, those are all vocabulary from mainstream theater. In order to activate things from the culture without being extractive.
Right.
And using, in order to relearn and transpose them, there are things that we have to do, and those things will be different for each culture.
Totally.
You know? I mean, even I was telling somebody about this recently. It's hard for white folks to understand that even when I am telling a family story, if it's a story that didn't happen to me, and maybe I wasn't born yet, and I may have heard that story my entire life, from the dining room table at Grandma's house, which is scenes in Izzy M, the alchemy of infrequent happened under that table. I still had to ask permission.
Right.
I had to go to my own mother.
Mm.
May I tell this story? I wasn't there. I wasn't born yet. I heard it all my life.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea of, it's become almost corny to say, well, stories have power, we are our stories and all of that, but it's actually true.
Right. Right.
And you can't just take somebody's story
Mm-hmm.
and you can be inspired by somebody's story, but then once you have to work it. You know, in Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way, we used a process of telling and retelling and retelling and retelling and writing the pictographs down and re-embodying and retelling until it became its own thing.
Right. And really what that is, what those principles and those aesthetics, the resurgence, the reclaiming, what you're also carrying it through is through a process. It's like it's going through its own impasse.
Right. That's right.
So it becomes something different where, like you said, you're not extracting culture or personal collective stories and then taking those for
slapping them on the stage as is.
Slapping them on the stage as is, right?
Very important thing I learned from my work with Floyd Fable is that whatever you do, it has to be passed through an artistic process.
Right.
Whatever the process is. And we have a number of those, you know, and with Izzy M, I used a completely different kind of structural framework in that I was looking at mounds and earthworks and what are the principles of those, and they vary, but there were certain ones that we were able, that the collaborators that I was working with at the beginning of that, we were able to identify, and also with the way, the stylistics of how a freak show is built and run and performed. So those two things have to come together.
I was recently, before our interview, just looking at some clips of YouTube and different things I could get from, you know, just a backstory. I mean, we've been in conversation for a little bit and I know a little bit about you, but you had said something really powerful. In one of the interviews you had said, you know, that this has saved my life. You know, this work, the theater work that you've been able to inherit from your family really has saved your life. I know it's a big question, but I was curious about, you know, what that means for you.
Now, of course, I'm in a different place now than I was when I said that.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of my intention set when I created Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way, that I was telling some personal stories that were juxtaposed with cultural stories and weaving them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I am talking about when I said it had to save my life, I wrote that piece, I created that piece at a time of great personal crisis. And it was that reconnecting that, and I think it's very, very prominent right now. It's become popular again in Indigenous performance circles to do, because we get a lot of kudos for it, right? You know, white folks love it. You know, oh, what a juicy story. It's that trauma porn, the trauma porn that we're asked to do over and over again. And I was really, and this was 2006, I was tired of telling my own victim stories. You know, I've been telling these and I'm really tired. What else have I got? What do I have that's not broken? Because I can tell the story of brokenness, of disconnect, of rupture, of suffering, of grief. I can tell that story really. I know I can be, you know, I can be entertaining.
Yeah. Yeah.
The really edgy things that when I worked with Michelle St. John and Jenny Lauzon in the Scrubbing Project that we did deliberately is that we took that pain and we did vaudeville out of it, you know. And I knew I could do that, but I was tired of doing that. So what I asked myself is, what would happen if instead of starting in a place of, I have this circle, I could start anywhere on that circle to tell a story, right? That's what I know from storytelling. It can start anywhere. But what if instead of starting from a place of brokenness, I started from a place of connection? So what am I still connected to? What am I got that's whole? And the ones that answered me was Chocolate Woman, Guna who is in Kuna life the most important medicine, and the Daughters from the Stars, the Nis Bundor. And those are the female powerful figures that I started with, because I knew I still had them and they were whole. And if I could remember them and call their names and learn how to say their names in Dulegaya, I had language in my mouth. And my mother performed with me in that. And I had put language in her mouth, which was very much more traumatic for her because she was the generation for whom it was
removed. Yeah.
So where I'm going, gimme, 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 I'll pronounce anything, say it again, say it again, say it again. For her, it was a different experience that was really painful of, why can't I say it? Why can't I say it right? I heard this every night before I went to bed. My father, my uncles, they sang every night, but why can't I say it? Why can't I say it? You know, so the process of going through that with my mother, it was rough. But once we got to the end, there was, and she talks about it now as being a process of healing, of reclamation. The way that you can say, and also because as part of this work, that I could not have done this work if in the earlier stages of development, I hadn't gone to Kunayala and reconnected, or connected for the first time. Family, land, and place.
I just got I got one person at my door. I'll be right back. Rock it. Rock it, get over here. Come on. Come on, in the house. Sorry about that.
Your dog ringing the doorbell?
That was my friend.
So what allowed me to do that work, and I wouldn't have been able to do that, to create that work, if I had not put my feet in my grandfather's birthplace, if I hadn't connected with the family that I have there. Because my grandpa, being a sailor, had families in different ports, right? So my mom had a brother older than her who was in Panama City, but from Yanduk Nargana. So meeting artists, you know, there, meeting family, so much family, putting my feet on sacred ground, that saved my life. And being able to tell the story of having done that.
Right. That's beautiful. It's like a coming home. It's a coming home. And, you know, when we did the workshop together, you had spoke about, you know, being a good receptor, having to be able to be a conduit for the information to even access. So what are the types of things that you've been able to do, practice in your own artistic way of how to maintain being a good receptor?
Ooh. Well, it goes farther than the work you do in the studio. It goes farther than the work you do at your computer. It goes farther, than any kind of workshop. It has to do with how you live your life. It has to do with being connected to ceremony, forces, and energy. It has to do with being awake and alive, not to be confused with being woke, but being awake, being present, being alive, reciprocity, not taking. In the land-based embodied research that I've done, that we did, and the piece that started out as Sideshow Freaks and Circus Indians, and what was performed to date was Izzy M, but the research was done with a collaborative team, including Choctaw novelist and poet Leanne Howe. And we traveled so many places to mound sites.
Right.
Some were burial mounds, some were mound complexes, but we never really discussed what we were going to do when we got there. But inevitably, out would come the tobacco. We'd get halfway up the mound and say, wait a minute, we need some food. What you got? Okay, I got a bag of corn chips in the trunk. It's not open. Okay, so we'll go up the mound with our tobacco and corn chips, because you can't go empty-handed. So that reciprocity of, you have to offer something. You can't just go and extract and take. And introducing yourself to the spirits of that land, to the spirits of the place. Introducing yourself, announcing yourself, and stating your purpose. And listening. Deep, deep listening. I don't know how to describe being a receptor. Some of it came from dance and theater training, on how you catch an impulse. Some of it came from active participation in ceremony and maintaining a personal spiritual practice, right? So all of those kind of came together, but they could be different for the next person, though done similar things with Santee Smith. Also doesn't go on to land and place without doing some version of Edge of the Woods. We were in Mexico, not this March, but 2019. And we needed to do that as a group. We had to, once we got there, we offered up food, we offered up smoke, and we needed to state to an Indigenous person from that place, which was Tepoztlan, that we are here and why we are here, and to the spirits of that place. And one of the days we were there, we went on a enormous climb to a top of a mountain where there was a temple to the Thunderers, right? It was an hour and a half up. And the Indigenous guide who took us we got to a certain place where there was like an opening in trees, and he took out the conch shell and he blew it. And every once in a while in that climb up, he would blow it. And he blew it to let the spirits know we were coming and what our intention was. So that to me is how you are a receptor.
Mm-hmm.
Because in order to offer yourself up for the stories of the land and asking that land and those elements, what do I need to know here? What's the most important thing for me to know? Take me where I need to, and then you have to watch. The ones that lead me are usually beings of transformation. They always are the first ones to show up every time, are the butterflies and the dragonflies. That's why I have these here.
Yeah,
yeah. Because they always lead.
It's interesting when we bring spirituality, spiritual practices, and ritual and ceremony into our work, that we need to be ready to receive. So I love how you're talking about that reciprocity. Rather than taking, extracting data research, let me do my research and take this knowledge. Like the arts is like notorious for these practices.
Right. It's not as simple as paying someone to be a consultant.
Right, exactly. But even
we had the trouble with that at the NAC, doing unnatural and accidental women, because even the vocabulary that you use, once it goes into an institution, it becomes something else. And we knew we're doing a show about missing and murdered women. We're calling out all these names of women, some of whom were real people, right? We said, well, we have to do a feast. Before we start, we have to do a feast. But you leave that in the institution, and what you get is some catered food with the entire protocols of the institution. So the spirits really let us know, that wasn't good enough.
Right.
And we had to do again. We had to do one, just us, where we touched that food.
Yeah.
We had to make it. And I tell you, one time I forgot my water bottle backstage after rehearsal was called. I went back there, and it was standing room only. They were like sardines. I was like, okay. And we had to. They let us know. We knew. Well, they want something. They want something, but they let us know. It was like they let us know the menu, and they let us know they wanted us. We had to sing and dance for them. So when you have that, and you're in an institution, it's like hard work. It was hard work. But then not because people said, no, by no means you can't have a feast, but there were issues around smudge throughout the entire. Here we are on a stage in a show about missing and murdered women, and there were issues about whether we could smudge.
Right.
So that's what happens in institutions.
Right.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the image that's coming to me when we're taking this very important sacred work into institutions, into larger theater context with all of those, lights and all of the, I guess, the way that the whole theater world functions that I don't really know much about, but I see the image of like the emotional vein being cut off. The spiritual vein, like there's things that just, it starts to sever, some of those, the work that you're talking about. And I know we've spoken a lot about you traveling you know, you've traveled to different places, you know, to create, to work in ensemble. What's that been like for you as, you know, kind of removing yourself from the territory that you were on and then going to these other territories? What's exciting about that? Can you share from that moment where a group merges together that's never worked together before and you're in a different place, learning about land and territory protocols? What's exciting in that moment?
I think in these, recent years, that has been what has excited me and brought me the most joy. Is going to different lands. I spent a lot of time around Santa Fe, looking at how those petroglyphs are, how those pictographs are different from the ones from Cunayala, which is tropical. We came out of Colombia up into Panama, and some of them are similar, some of them are really, really different, but how on that land is so strong in the Southwest. Very different from the land in the rainforest. Going to lands with Leanne Howe that I mentioned before, is in lands from the mounds that were in St. Paul, Minnesota. I met up with her in I went to Iowa. I met up with her in Cahokia, which is right outside St. Louis, which was the largest mound city on the continent. Wonder why so much stuff jumps off around St. Louis. They, as recently as 2017, they destroyed 100 mounds in that city. The grounds where the 1904 World's Fair was built, they had to destroy 16 mounds to build that, drain a street. And that's like 20 minutes from Ferguson. So what were things are little dicey around there? We also then we did 2 trips. We drove once around Oklahoma to some mounds, and we drove from Oklahoma to Louisiana and Mississippi, and then, it was 2 trips. And the other one we went across through Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and back through. So we went to Moundville, we went to Natchez, we went to Naniwaya, which is her mother mound. We went to mounds in Toronto.
Interesting.
There are mounds all over. I went to mounds in Virginia, remnants of mounds in Maryland. And I guess what is most powerful to me about that work is the reconnecting of our original relationships, our original kinship among nations before that interrupted.
I love that. I love that.
People here over by Peterborough, Rice Lake, where there are serpent mounds. Those serpent mounds are in direct correspondence with the serpent mound in Ohio, in southern Ohio. They know, they still retain the knowledge that the technology for building those mounds, which are Anishinaabe, came south, came from the Shawnee. So we know this.
Right.
We know that we were connected by waterways, and those mounds are always next to water. We know that we knew about each other.
Right.
So to me, to be able to make those connections in what is similar in Indigenous knowledge, and to look at the things that are so different. And those things that are so different are very often based on land and and geography, but there'll be a value that is the same.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're talking about buffalo or whether you're talking about corn or whether you're talking about salmon, there is an element of value, a being that has that is the sustainer of the people.
Totally. And it also it subverts that power control that humans govern land, where it's in its essence, it's the opposite. You know, these mounds, our territories, our lands, what sustains us, the knowledge embedded, those values that we've embodied in relationship to all of the sustenance around us. It's really, that's what's governing and has governed our evolution.
Identities are, you know, who we are as humans, our identities as humans, how it is to be a human.
Right.
And what's interesting about a place like Cahokia, which is the one outside of St. Louis, is that's where the three largest language groups emerged. So the Iroquoian, the Muskogean, and the I just lost the other, the Algonquin. They all originated at Cahokia and did their migrations. So migration and how we are related through those old paths. You know, because there is a place where here on this continent, we are connected and we used to know that. And a lot of it has to do with corn and how corn traveled.
Right.
And our old economic systems and trade routes. There's something else on my mind and I just lost it. Maybe it'll come back. But I'm off territory, living here in Toronto. I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else, 37 years just about now. I'm out of territory unless I look at it as I am in the northern edge of Algonquin territory. No, the Rappahannocks are the southern tip. You know, the Powhatan Confederacy is the southern tip of Algonquin-speaking peoples. You know, and they go all the way across. You know, I think one's like Blackfeet and is it Arapaho? I think are still, you know, Algonquin languages. It's a very large, you know, so because the people moved.
Yeah.
And we shared things. And the Delaware that ended up in Muncie or on Six Nations are relatives of those people. The Annexes are Renape and they're Lenape. Are, you know, people were forcibly removed in more recent history. But also a time where there were pre-contact, where there were migrations and clans that took certain knowledge and went in different directions.
I love the work that you're talking about the traveling, the migrating, and remembering the unity, and most importantly, the nationhood that has always, you know, has always been there. And I think it's something we need to remind ourselves over and over as we step into creative practice with other Indigenous people, global Indigenous, even outside of North America, really kind of expanding, nationhood again, and aligning with one another, building alliances amongst our communities in a good way. Like, this is something that I think, you know, there's so many challenges to that, but I think it's something that we need to not forget. And just one more question that I had on the list that I thought in terms of like faculty seeing this, but also any advice, just as we come to a close? I know, you know, we've chatted for a while, and I'm really, you've talked a lot about a lot of values that I think have woven into this conversation. So I really appreciate that. Reciprocity, respect, deep listening, permission, protocols. Like, these are all really rich ways, I think, of creating work, not just for the self, for the collective, but also for audience to really also receive all of that hard work as well in a good way. But the last question that I was thinking about was about students heading into, you know, the theater institution or theater school. Do you have any kind of, I guess, advice, you know, you would want to say to students?
Wow. I think that's a hard one. I think there are certain basics that one can learn in theater school: how to use your voice, how to make your body accessible to you, how to, the different ways of building a character, you know, things like that. But I think that theater school and studying Euro-centered theater can cause a lot of damage and has caused a lot of harm to performers. I trained in theater and dance at a very specific time and place. I was in New York City in the 50s. I was in university in Buffalo, at SUNY Buffalo, in the mid-70s. There were very specific time and place, but I was always on the fringes, you know, in the, when I was in university, none of us darkies ever got cast in the departmental productions. We just didn't. So there was one teacher there, her name is Lorna Hill. She's still creating in Buffalo. She created 2 different groups that were almost like ad hoc performance group. We were all the ones who never got cast in anything. So she cast a women's theater ensemble workshop called All Female Cast. And she cast a Black theater workshop that became Ujima Company. So in order to be cast, in order to create work that reflected who I was, I had to either perform in all women's company or in the Black company. So, as I said, there was a specific time and place. I think that there's a certain tradition of teaching theater that's very, I don't know, maybe it's the Grotowski thing and all that, but it's built around breaking you down. You know, breaking down, you break everything down so that you're then malleable, and it's based on master slave, you know. So, and there's one thing that I think Indigenous people and Indigenous artists and young people going into training do not need is the reinforcement of master slave and being broken, having their ego all broken down. Right. So
that's good. That's good.
You know, there are places like the Center for Indigenous Theatre. I think that place needs more Indigenous teachers. Yeah. And I think that's something that I can say aloud because we know it, and I know it's something that's been worked on, you know, over the years. But then there are places like, you know, Santi was training people for a while. She's no longer, it wasn't sustainable for her to train people in dance. I believe Amatagzi up at Nipissing does train community people. I think that you have to be damn secure and grounded in who you are and in your culture to make it out alive of those training institutions.
That's good advice. Know who you are. Not breaking down, but building up, and more Indigenous faculty in all institutions for training. And I think is primary.
And one of the things that it's not only a personal observation of a lot of the training, but when I was in Poland, I've gone there several times, and one of the things I learned is that in Poland, there is a lot of questioning and a lot of outing of the abusive practice of fertility. Like suicides galore in the people that he took out into the bush and broke down, you know? So it's no longer in Poland, where he came from, where he worked, it's no longer held up as the end all be all. There are people saying, oh, well, yeah, that didn't work out so well.
Yeah,
you know, lost a whole bunch of people.
Totally.
But that has also been taken and bled into the way that actors and theater creators are trained in Europe and in North America. So I have big questions about that. I have big questions about white directors that work in that way with Indigenous actors. And I won't do it anymore.
Right. Yeah. And we talked a little bit about, one of the last questions was around what type of values would, or if, you know, non-Indigenous directors want to work with Indigenous communities, what types of values, in your opinion, or what needs to happen for that to be successful?
This moment in history, the only way I can answer that is like, move over, give up your seat. Give up your place. If you're serious, you give up that power.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Noidi.
I really appreciate connecting again. It's been really wholesome, I would say, since the first time that I met you at UVic, being in the workshop with you. You've just given me language. You've given me an objective place to really, I think, reflect in my own practice. And I really appreciate your past experiences, your work with your family, your mother, like it's all coming down. And as a younger person coming into this field, you and your family's work is a barometer for me. You know, I'm like, how do I, you know, where do I sit within this type of work that I so much value? Because I can see the ripple effects and how it impacts community, how it impacts individuals, and how it has the power to heal and give voice to our people, you know, where we're not broken, that we can, you know, work from that place of wholeness and connection. And I think working with the land and following protocol, implementing ritual and spirituality in a collective way is very powerful. So thank you. Your practice is not unseen nor or devalued. You know, it's very much that for me. So thank you.
I want to clarify something.
Yes.
That bringing in ceremony is not something that I do in a performative way. Those are all that you do to get ready to do that, preparing yourself before going on stage. That taking ceremony and slapping it on stage is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this is what you do. This is what you do as a process.
Right.
There are two words that I learned, and they mean slightly different things, from Leanne Howe and her husband, Jim Wilson, from a conversation in their kitchen in Ada, Oklahoma. And I'll never forget these two words, because we got into a whole conversation about what's the difference. He said, to animate and activate. The original purposes within Indigenous knowledge. And I said, okay, what's it? Animate and activate. That sounds like it's almost the same thing. What's it? To activate, that has to do with action, movement, and animate, animus has to do with the spirit, right? So work has to be work that moves the spirit. And that's where my interest is.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I hope to see you again. You're always welcome here on the West Coast, and I really hope to work with you in the near future.
Bring me back.
Yes.